light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I'm Sister Who. Sometimes I get a little concerned because some people seem to put me on a pedestal, and I don't know that I've ever tried to be anything more than just a human being, but I try to bring the best of me to this work and to share it as much as I can. And some people don't want to receive that. They don't want to share it, but it's available. But there have been some incidences along with that were extremely painful, and where perhaps every person of faith gets to wrestle with the question of forgiveness. And it's easy for those who have not been affected to say, oh, just forgive them, as if it's supposed to be as if it never happened, which of course it isn't. And I was bullied a lot growing up, in school and so forth. And in every situation, there was an adult or an administrator or somebody who stood by and did nothing. And I'm not trying to put myself on a pedestal either in terms of, gee, look how much I've suffered. No, it's not that I've suffered more or as bad as a lot of other people. But the point is, to me, is that suffering is not a competitive sport. And each person who suffers knows their pain and knows how it affects them. And it may be better or worse in somebody's estimation than somebody else's. But even the person who hasn't suffered that much on the outside may have suffered so much on the inside that they wind up committing suicide. So how do we really say who's better or worse? But again, I don't think it should be a competitive sport. It's just, it is what it is. And the only appropriate response to any suffering is compassion. But there are some times where the hurt is so deep and the wound is so awful that it can take a very, very long time to recover, if one ever does. There are some people who are so deeply wounded that they may spend their entire lives and never be able to resolve it because of what happened. And anytime wounding happens, to me, would be a form of evil. And it's been said for hundreds of years, I think, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good to do nothing. And there were an innumerable amount of times, I've lost count a long time ago, of the times where evil happened because good did nothing. But I guess the important thing to me is that I lived through it, and that as bad as it wasn't enough to kill me, and it wasn't enough to stop me. And it wasn't actually enough to stop me from being me. That no matter what loss or terrible thing I experienced, there was life after it. And it was different because I didn't have the resources and the relationships that I had prior to that terrible event. But life did go on in one form or another. And it's not that one should be dismissive about it, because there's still something there that needs to be healed. And hopefully in time, those deep wounds will eventually find their healing. But there are some areas of my life where that hasn't happened yet. And as I look at those, and I sometimes pray, God, you better get to them before I do, because if you leave it to me, I'm going to overreact and I'm going to be way too harsh. But from a divine perspective, there's some balance between justice and mercy and love and all of it mixed together that somehow allows God to respond to people's evil deeds in ways that are appropriate, sometimes wiser than we would think. But and it's where some people talk about the law of karma, that what goes around comes around. And I said, well, if that were true, then everything I've given would eventually come back to me, but maybe it's still on its way, I don't know. But there's a lot of giving that I've done that hasn't been rewarded yet. So I don't really know how to buy into the law of karma, because sometimes it seems to work and sometimes it doesn't. But in the same way, I would say that I believe miracles still occur. I just don't believe they're predictable. But there's always something that we can't explain, something that happens in defiance of all probability and statistics. But over and over and over again, the good and the bad of being human, I guess, is that we are creatures of time. We have wonderful moments, and they pass into a memory as quickly as they happen. And we can't stay there without giving up life. We can't stagnate in any particular moment without giving up all the life that would otherwise follow. And so we're creatures of time, and the only thing we can really do is take all that we've experienced and all that we've known, all the ways that we've been hurt even, and try to find ways to turn that into raw material from which to make something good in the future. Where I grew up in the country outside of town in southern Wisconsin, we discovered at one point that along a particular neighbor's creek in their cow pasture was this huge deposit of clay that was almost pure. It was just naturally occurring gray clay that was in the riverbank. And so we went there and came back with buckets of it and fashioned it into all kinds of vessels and everything. We didn't have a kiln to fire it into porcelain, but it was clay that was free and available, and the neighbor said, sure, take all you want. But from seeing that, the thing that we have to remember when you look at this beautiful piece of glazed porcelain is that it didn't start out that way. That originally, even the most beautiful porcelain was a bunch of ugly, sticky, slimy, gray clay in the side of somebody's riverbank. And so we had to be willing to get our hands dirty and take buckets of this sticky gray clay, take it home and fashion it into something. And if we'd had a potter's wheel and a kiln, it could have been porcelain, where we would have, wedged it, as they say, kneading it over and over again until it's clean, pure enough, and then using a potter's wheel. I used a potter's wheel briefly when I was in college, and I have 2 or 3 things that I made, and it's quite a challenge to keep it centered on the wheel and decide exactly how to apply pressure to make it into this vase, and thinner here and thicker there, and how tall, and all those sorts of different things. And then after that, to let it dry, and then to do the bisque firing, and then the glaze firing, and you wind up with this incredibly beautiful porcelain piece of dinnerware or vase or whatever you decided to make. But it didn't start out that way. It started out as ucky gray clay. So, as creatures of time, we have the good moments and the bad moments. In a marriage vows, they talk about for better, for worse, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, until death do us part. I don't know too many people who can say that for richer, for poor anymore, because everything seems to depend on your bank balance, like someone is marrying the bank balance more than they're marrying the person. But, the point being that if you're together long enough, you will see all the roles and all the experiences, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, times where each one is being the breadwinner or the homemaker or the supporter or the supported. All that stuff factors in. It's not reasons to avoid a relationship or to avoid an experience even, because it's all part of the whole huge picture that life includes. With all of that in mind, people sometimes speak of the generation gap, because young people have a way of seeing things and older people have a way of seeing things, and they're often very different. And if there isn't enough dialogue between the two, they may not understand how much they have in common. There was an older school teacher for whom I did odd jobs for several years during high school and immediately after. And I still remember the day, just like it was yesterday, where I was helping her put some flowers around gravestones of people she had known who were buried in the cemetery. And while she was picking out some dead leaves and straightening up some flowers at a stone over here, about 10 feet away, I was looking at this other stone and just remarking for no reason, this person only lived 18 years, judging by the dates on the stone. And she looked over, glanced over my way and said, "Oh yeah, that was one of my classmates. She died of tuberculosis." And I just thought how incredible that I was looking at this stone, and it was not just a name on the stone. It was not just some numbers. It was someone that she actually knew, and she knew what the story was, and she knew who it was, what color hair the person had, how old they were when they died, what they died of. It was this not collision, but this intersection in time where we were in this year and she was commenting on something that had happened 50, 60, 70 years before. And it was as if it was all the same. It was all part of one big story. And so at that point is when I began considering that the experiences that I thought they taught history wrong, because all they taught us was the names and the dates. They didn't tell us how people felt, what questions they were struggling to resolve. The idea of the men who wrote the first Constitution for the United States coming together to form a new government relatively out of nothing. They drew from different documents, and especially the Native Americans, but they were basically trying to form a governing document that could govern a country, that could deal with all the inequities and all the differences, and somehow keep everybody on the same page with a common goal of being a nation. How would you begin to write a document like that? I mean, I wouldn't know where to start. Sister X was a man who was a freelance photographer and a Cree Indian, so he brought the cultural heritage of his Native American tribe and presented that, so that when I became Sister Who, I could integrate some of the notions he spoke of the sacred clown, the person who puts forth questions and uses symbols and metaphors specifically to prevent social stagnation within the tribe. That if somebody was ever getting in a rut, the sacred clown in the tribe would show up and put something challenging in their path to give them a new way of looking at their own life, to give them a new way of looking at themselves. And in all of that, trying to incorporate all these different contrasts and empowering juxtapositions. One of the things I incorporated at the very beginning with Sister Who was that I've always worn hiking boots, because I want practical shoes that can be worn for long hours and do lots of work in any situation. I don't want to be in a situation where I'm wearing high heels like a drag queen and my feet are so sore that after 1 or 2 hours of helping with a fundraiser or an event of some sort, my feet are too tired and I have to stop. No, these are hiking boots that I could wear for as long as necessary in any situation, anywhere we go. And it was about 3 years after becoming Sister Who that someone suggested to me, what about actually hiking mountains? And so at the time of this recording, I have thus far done 16 of the highest mountains in Colorado in full ritual garb. And there's so many incredible stories about what I've encountered going up and down mountains, because it's the last thing you would expect, but of course that's what happened on the way up Quandary Peak, is that I was going up and this woman came down the trail with this distraught look on her face, and she said, "Aren't you the one I've seen on television?" And I said, "Well, yes, how did you find me?" And not at all what she would expect, but there are so many more stories of what people I have met. When I was going up Mount Bierstadt, my first one, I actually met a young woman along the trail who was at that moment contemplating whether or not to become a Roman Catholic nun. And so for 20 minutes, she and I are having this conversation about religious vocation in contemporary life. And what is it that makes a nun a nun? And I presented to her, I think she agreed, but she didn't really say, that the signature quality is that it's a dedication to spiritual service. I have never done anything intentionally satirical or any spoofer or in any way trying to put down nuns. I was taught by nuns in grade school, and I have a lot of respect for them. But like anybody else, there's a whole range of different people who have chosen that religious vocation for various reasons. There's also people who have left that religious vocation for various reasons. and that's fine too. But that's a whole nother conversation for another time. The point I guess I keep coming back to, though, is that we're creatures of time, and when we have these deep wounds, we're human beings, and how do we move past them, and how do we deal with them, and how do we find a sense of peace in the midst of them while the healing is still happening and it hasn't been finished yet. And when I was forced out of some of the houses that I was trying to fix up, it was I read a book once. It's a book entitled The Emotional Rape Syndrome. And some people argue with me about using the word rape, but as the author of that book says, he has interviewed so many people who are not physically raped, and yet they are showing exactly the same symptoms as someone who had been, because it was a deeper level. It was a psychological and emotional rape that on the inside did every bit as much damage to them as a physical rape does to those who experience physical rape. And in both cases, he says, people need to find healing, whether you've been physically raped or mentally raped or emotionally raped, and so that's where I started pondering, what is it that really defines a rape? Is it simply the violation of the physical body, or is it more than that? And I decided, for myself at least, the two signature qualities of rape are violation and violence. There is some kind of really violent nature to the interaction, and there is some way that it totally violates the very heart and soul and core of that person. And whether you're dealing with it on a physical level or an emotional level or psychological level, when people deny you the reality of your experience, it makes it that much harder to move toward healing. And yet healing is what everybody needs. And if we're not competing for who has suffered the most, then we don't need to get into mine's worse than yours, or yours is worse than mine, or that's not bad at all. The point is, the person in front of you is suffering and in pain, and they need to find healing. Going back to this elderly school teacher, though, her story wasn't so tragic. I mean, in some ways it was very benign, and yet what was admirable about her was her ability to retain empathy and to be open to learning something new, and to that she demonstrated, understood that we go through the events and we're creatures of time, but our life is not about the events. Our life is about being the people that we are in the midst of them, having a unique consciousness and a unique perspective and a unique collection of experiences. And so we go through these things, and hopefully we learn and we grow as we do so, but hopefully we find some sort of love and some sort of, the word that comes to mind is eternity. Something that transcends the temporal limitations of our lives, something that goes beyond just being in a moment and gives us a sense of consciousness, a sense of being that extends way, way beyond that moment and allows us to experience past, present, and future without being constrained to only one of them. I mentioned to someone once that if you use the metaphor of vision, there are people who say we need to live in the now, and I would say metaphorically that's the equivalent of glaucoma, tunnel vision, where all you see is the present. And for the people who only live in the past and the future, they only think about what was and what will be, they cannot be fully present where they are. And I said, well, in terms of vision, that's macular degeneration. In order to have whole, healthy vision, you need to have the whole spectrum. You need to have past, present, and future, and relate to each one appropriately. In remembering this school teacher and the lessons that I could draw out of that, all of that kind of came together, and I kind of meshed my philosophical ponderings and the actual experiences into a partially fictional song, I suppose. But I'd like to share that with you now. The light from the window on the faded old chair caused her blue eyes to sparkle like the age wasn't there. I quietly listened. I tried to remember each story she told me, each moment we shared. Each day is a present to live and to be. Just like Christmas morning, she'd say to me, make lots of memories and a good world to live in. Remember to listen. And one more thing she'd say. Though nobody hears me and they don't understand that tomorrow is yesterday, still here in our hands. Let's cherish this moment now as it slips away. So when you are lonely, remember today. The flowers we planted, trimming bushes and trees, the seasonal changes accepted with ease, her loving example, her interest in my dreams, her continuous learning. I remember all these. I was in college, so far away, yet one of her letters could brighten my day. In summer we'd still go to the old cemetery, placing flowers by gravestones of friends passed away. Though nobody hears me and they don't understand that tomorrow is yesterday, still here in our hands. Let's cherish this moment now as it slips away. So when you are lonely, remember today. Her inspiration, like the light in her eyes, lingered close by me as a help and a guide. When the world gets confusing and too much is changing, I recall her example and just let it all be. It was years later I finally learned my teacher was gone too, and so I returned in the cold of the winter to the old cemetery to visit a gravestone of a friend passed away. Though nobody hears me and they don't understand that tomorrow is yesterday, still here in our hands. Let's cherish this moment now as it slips away. So when you are lonely, remember today. That's what she would say. Remember today. I remember when I was in college, one of the things she sent me once was homemade chocolate marshmallow Easter eggs. I didn't know that was possible. How do you even make a homemade marshmallow-filled chocolate Easter egg? But she knew how to do it. I suppose from the time before you could buy them in the store. In any case, thank you very much for spending this half hour with me. I hope it's been helpful to you.